Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology and Around. My guest today is Tim Alberta, who is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and staff writer for The Atlantic magazine. He formerly served as chief political correspondent for POLITICO. In 2019, he published the critically acclaimed book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. And just last year, he released this book, which I have my hands right now. It's an excellent book I'm currently reading. It's titled The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicalism in an Age of Extremism. I've really appreciated, first of all, this book is incredibly well written. It's hard to put down. His journalism is really good, and he's a very thoughtful writer, but he's also, he critiques kind of the underbelly of the American evangelical church from the perspective of somebody who clearly loves the evangelical church. That's what I appreciated most about his posture, both in the book and in this conversation. He's not a church basher. He's one that wants to see the church be more like Jesus at the end of the day. And sometimes political idolatry is getting in the way of that. And that's what we talk about in this really interesting and fascinating conversation. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Tim Alberta. All right, welcome to Theology and Raw, Tim. Very excited to have you on. Really loving your really fascinating and in some sense disturbing book, which we'll get into. But why don't you just tell us a bit of background of who you are? Specifically, you're an evangelical, grew up in the church, dad's a pastor. How did you get into the intersection between faith and politics?
Well, Preston, thanks for having me. I would say, in a word, accidentally. I really never had any grand plan to write about this stuff. If anything, I was pursuing a career in journalism as a young man because I fantasized about being a baseball writer and just traveling around the country and writing about games and hanging out with players in the hotel bar and just sort of being a part of the traveling circus there. And I wound up taking an unplanned detour into covering politics pretty late in my undergraduate studies when I was at Michigan State. Wound up covering the state capitol, was good at it, wound up getting an opportunity to go to Washington and intern for the Wall Street Journal, cover Congress. One thing led to another. And, after this sort of series of happy accidents, I wound up in a position to be sort of really on the front lines covering the intersection of conservative movement politics with the Republican Party's evolution, certainly in the post-George W. Bush years and with the rise of Trump, and then kind of where all of that met with the activist wing of the evangelical movement and understanding how this alliance came to be and really watching up close and having a front row seat to see the ways in which the sausage is made, so to speak. And, as someone who was raised in the church and who speaks the language and who is, still very much a part of the church, I had really begun to grow uncomfortable in recent years with what I'd seen. I mean, frankly, I'd been uncomfortable with it for a long time, but I think a combination of things sort of just compelled me to keep quiet about it for the most part. I mean, I would have conversations with friends and family, but I was never, I never wanted to be that guy to go like air the dirty laundry of the church or speak out against his tribe. It's no fun to do. I think I, like many Christians, many evangelicals, I was just sort of hoping that it would go away on its own, that it would resolve itself, and that these flare-ups would just be temporary, and that I could afford to just turn the other way and kind of turn a blind eye, pretend it wasn't happening. But instead, it just sort of kept getting worse, and that's, I think, ultimately what forced my hand.
Why don't you unpack what do you mean when you keep saying it, or how the sausage is made? When you peek behind the curtain, what did you see? What is this thing that was disturbing to you? How would you describe that?
I've heard it described as like the evangelical industrial complex, or different sort of ways of labeling it. I mean, I think for me, it's really just the sense that the church and that the sort of affiliates of the church, and by that I mean, what the entire sort of constellation of American evangelicalism, the seminaries, the non-for-profits, the media enterprises, the conference circuit tour, all of that stuff, that it was becoming that it was losing the plot, that it was becoming less and less invested in the work of discipleship and engaging the culture in a humble and winsome and loving way, and more concerned with a sort of zero-sum, us versus them, militaristic approach to everything in the world around it. The politics and the culture wars and the sort of, and I think that this is happening at a time, mind you, when American life across the board has been really sucked into this phenomenon of self-sorting and self-selection, where depending on the kind of car you drive and the kind of sitcom you watch and the kind of beer you buy at the grocery store, like that, these indicators are going to push you into these little silos that you really don't leave otherwise. And I think that the church, which should be our one institution that rises above those silos and is better than that self-sorting, I think has instead become sort of, in many ways, the poster child for that self-sorting. And I understand why. I mean, the culture has obviously been in turmoil for a long time, but at least talking in the modern post 9/11 era, I understand why so many evangelical Christians, friends, family members of mine, people who I love, came to feel themselves being sort of always on the defensive and under attack, and then feeling therefore justified in sort of lashing out, fighting back, whatever. But it became clear to me that was doing a profound damage to the credibility of the church and ultimately to the witness.
That's helpful. I just have to say, I mean, your book, it's very clear that you're a writer who happens to be a Christian. And what I mean by that is, there's lots of Christians who get a platform and then they write a book, but they're not like you could tell, I mean, writing is, unless they have like a really good ghostwriter, which a lot of them do, the writing isn't their primary artistic, gifting, if not passion. But for you, it seems like you're primarily a writer, and so the book is, I mean, it's a page turner. It's a massive book. It's huge. I don't know how many words it actually is. It's like 300-400 pages, but it actually feels almost like a light read, just because all of a sudden you look up and it's like, gosh, I blew through like 25 pages because it's such a fluid book. What I appreciated most about it, though, is I feel like you were like very genuine and sincere, and I didn't, while you unveil, I would say, a pretty, the dark underbelly of evangelicalism, you did so in a way that I never ever got the sense that you were like bitter at the church, angry at the church. Like, it was very much a deep love for the church. So that's what I appreciated most about the book, because it's easy to find all the dark stuff. There's been books that have done that, but the posture which you did, I thought it made it so compelling. Can you do talk? So you name names in the book. I mean, you're quoting people that discussions you've had with people. What are the institutions that I feel like it almost? I don't know if this is an accurate representation, but almost like a lens that represents a lot of what you're talking about that comes up over and over is Liberty University. Can you? I don't know, for the audience that hasn't read the book, or maybe they are reading it. Tell us about the history of Liberty University, and I'm sorry, one more qualification. I've actually taught at Liberty online for like a couple of years. Lots of professors come out of their students that are amazing. So there's lots of good people there that have come out of there, but there is a dark side to the history. Can you tell us a bit about that and kind of what you discuss in the books? I think it's really an important part of the narrative.
Yeah, to your point a minute ago, I think being able to love the church and love its people while also calling out what is wrong and what is corrupt and what is hypocritical. I mean, those things are not mutually exclusive, right? To my view, and liberty in a lot of ways is sort of a perfect case study for understanding both the promise of evangelicalism and the potential of evangelicalism, but also that dark side you're describing, and understanding the ways in which power and earthly exaltation and money can corrupt the soul of the church. So, I try to use the story of Jerry Falwell Sr., dating back to, of course, the mid 1970s, to really paint the picture of what has happened to the movement as a whole. Because, if you hear a lot of the rhetoric today around, we are under attack, we are under siege, we're being persecuted in our own country, that the cultural values that we once knew are gone, that they're indoctrinating our children, that this is our last stand, and if we don't take back our country now, then it'll be gone forever. If that rhetoric sounds familiar, it's because that is exactly the rhetoric, the messaging that Jerry Falwell Sr. mastered and weaponized so effectively, 50, 60 years ago. And of course, it seems a little bit silly because at the time, looking back, this is when America was 90% white, 90% Christian. Everybody went to church, right? There was not seemingly some existential crisis facing believers at that point. And yet you did have, the Supreme Court ruling taking prayer out of public schools. You had Roe v. Wade. You had the sexual revolution. You had the drug culture. You had divorce rates spiking. You had homosexuality suddenly sort of in the face, pornography in the face of families. And so of course, Falwell Sr. and a lot of like-minded Christians, whether they be sort of more leaning in the fundamentalist camp or evangelical camp, and of course they eventually sort of merge, they really saw an opportunity there to capitalize on that crisis, capitalize on that fear, and build out a movement that was really all about social, cultural, and political power, right? And believing that if they could secure those things, then that would sort of preserve their place in American life. And that they were right. They were right. Falwell builds out Thomas Road Baptist Church, his mega church in Lynchburg, Virginia. He builds out Liberty University into this behemoth, and then, of course, builds out the Moral Majority into this overwhelming electoral force. And with those three cogs of the machine, Falwell Sr. and his allies, they really transform American life. I mean, they are able to impose their value set on the Republican Party, and then more broadly, or sort of by consequence, then impose their value set on much of the nation, and create sort of very specific litmus tests for that anyone aspiring to hold office in the Republican Party must pass. And it's difficult to overstate just what a dramatic effect this all had on our social culture, our political culture. But I think, what hasn't necessarily been appreciated was how that success, that earthly success, corroded the soul of those very institutions, right? I mean, and Liberty, again, is sort of the case study of this, where you would know, Preston, having taught there, having gotten to know people there. But what I do in my book is I retrace just through the eyes of one family to understand the sort of the generational disillusionment and the damage that is done when people who have invested themselves in that school, and then, of course, sort of invested themselves in the movement more broadly, come to realize that they have been played, that they've been manipulated, that they've been abused spiritually or otherwise, and how the sort of collective effect of that is actually sort of draining evangelical spaces of its most of its most valuable resource, which is, people who love the Lord, who want to preach the gospel, who want to spread the gospel, who want to be evangelists in their community, but have become really skeptical, if not downright cynical, about what it really is that they are a part of and whether they want to be a part of it anymore.
Yeah, it was really, I mean, I love that you trace it through the lens of the family, and everything you did was so, you humanize the story, the good and the bad. Like, you humanize the people that were really, I think, were good-hearted and started to see some of the corruption. Even the people that were maybe part of the corruption, you even humanized them, which I thought was really helpful. Yeah, it's just so. I'm curious. So the moral, even though I was born in '76, so I grew up in the '80s, but still, I was just a kid. I didn't pay attention to stuff. It's almost like looking back now, I see this whole thing about the moral majority and like the marriage between like the evangelical church and the Republican Party. Was it Jerry Falwell Sr. he really was the catalyst that sparked this still ongoing close relationship between evangelical church and the Republican Party? Like, before Jerry Falwell Sr., was it not really there? Or,
well, it's interesting because you can look back at these certain inflection points and really see how this alliance was formed. And it's not any one person, it's not any one moment, but I think in a lot of ways that, the Falwell Sr. is sort of the godfather of this alliance, right? Because what you have is it's important to remember that Falwell, of course, was himself coming from a fundamentalist background where they preached a separatism, right?
Yeah.
Their churches were really invested in this idea of politics being dirty and sordid business that is beneath us as believers, and that we need to just be invested in saving souls, not winning elections. And Falwell Sr. rather famously would rail against Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the black clergymen who were marching for civil rights, using that same rationale, right? Saying that this is not our job. This stuff you're obsessing over, it's not our job. And then, of course, he has this very dramatic change of heart, and he would later point to abortion. But the fact is, and this is obviously very well documented, Falwell Jr. didn't preach about abortion from his pulpit until 5 years after Roe v. Wade was overturned, right? So there's this very neatly constructed history that people in the evangelical movement, specifically the sort of the graybeards, some of the founding fathers of the modern evangelical movement, would like to tell you about where this started and why. But a lot of it, I'm going slightly off course in response to your question, but I think this is really important for people to understand. A lot of that history is very complicated and it's very dark. The truth of the matter is, and this is, again, there's a great amount of historical evidence to back this up. A lot of the activity, a lot of the organizing that was done in the early to mid 1970s around sort of fusing conservative theological institutions with conservative politics and political entities was around the IRS activity at Bob Jones University, where Bob Jones initially would not admit black students, and then was later banning any interracial dating on campus. And when the IRS, under both the Nixon and Carter administrations, was nosing around there, a lot of religious conservatives were saying, well, hold on a second. This is the government trying to dictate to trying to violate our First Amendment rights, trying to dictate to us how we should run our religious organizations. And that really, in a lot of ways, was kind of a spark that lit the fire. And people are uncomfortable discussing that history for the same reason that they're uncomfortable talking about how the Southern Baptist Convention was born out of opposition to the abolitionist cause, right? I mean, the SBC was founded as an explicitly pro-slavery entity, and that history has to be addressed. But I think, getting full circle back to your question, Falwell was such an influential figure in the fusing of conservative politics with conservative theology, in part because he straddled this intersection of, the sort of old Confederate South coming out of the Jim Crow era, a lot of this racial resentment buildup. I document in the book some of the very unsavory remarks that Falwell Sr. himself made about race over the years, right? And so understanding how racial resentment kind of merged together with cultural resentment, a belief that not only does the country not look like it used to, wink and nod, but also that the country's core values are changing and that we find ourselves on the defensive. Falwell sort of embodied both. And I think that that's why he emerges as really the key figure here.
You take us up to kind of recent day. I mean, the book came out in 2023, I believe. Yeah. 2024.
In December.
But I mean, you had documentation for like a few months before the release. So your publisher must have hated you for sneaking in data at the last second. I know how that works. But two questions kind of similar. Like, do you see Liberty University as being in a much more healthy spot? Has it learned from some of the dark side of kind of its movement? And I'm also curious the response to your book, because you had like apparently phone conversations with Jerry Jr. I mean, you document pretty well from people at the top, like, again, some of the dark side of what went on. So yeah, two sides of the same question. Like, how would you understand the health of Liberty now? And have you gotten any lawsuits thrown at you or anything or like, what's been the response to you being very explicit in your documentation in the book?
Yeah, no lawsuits yet. We had to be pretty careful with lawyers and whatnot going through all the language before the book published. To answer the first question, again, I can't overstate it because we've talked about this a bit already. Liberty is a place that is filled with wonderful students, wonderful faculty, people who are not a party to this corruption and the abuse and a lot of students. Like I know, in fact, right now, a pastor friend of mine, his daughter is going to Liberty next fall, right? And it's because she's a graduating senior and she wants to go to college somewhere where she's surrounded by faithful Christians, and she doesn't, when she investigates her options and comes across Liberty and sees the campus, which is beautiful. It's like if people have not been to Liberty in the last 5-10 years, it is. I've been all over the country. I speak at college campuses everywhere. Liberty is one of the most beautiful campuses I've ever seen. I mean, it is a spectacular world-class environment. What they have built there, it's just really stunning. So for a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, put yourself in their shoes. You find this place and it's big and it's beautiful and they've got all these majors that appeal to you and they've got convocation where they bring in these A-list speakers and you're thinking to yourself, well, this is great, right? You're really not dumpster diving on the Falwell family. You're not doing some deep investigation to find the skeletons hidden in Liberty's closet. Now, maybe after reading some of what I have in my book or some of the other work that's been done in recent years, that would behoove some of these young people to really understand exactly what they're getting themselves into. But I can see how for years and years, a lot of these young people who don't really know any better, they just love the Lord and they want to get an education. So they go to Liberty, and they are, I think, largely blind to a lot of the institutional decay there, right? They're just going to class, getting grades, graduating, moving on into the world. But even now, I spend time in the book talking with the student body president, who's a wonderful young man. And he and I are chewing on this question of, well, how do you reform a place once you see what's wrong? Which I think for kids like this young man, Daniel, the student body president, he can see it. He's on the inside and he's trying to change it from the inside. But there are also others who have just walked away entirely, who have left the school because they feel like maybe it's it can't be saved, or they just don't want to pour themselves into saving it because it would do too much damage to their souls or whatever the reason. So liberty is a really confounding case study here to understand that an institution can be really broken in a lot of ways, but can still have a lot of good in it, can still have a lot of really just great and God-fearing and lovely people who are there doing the work every day, trying to do the Lord's work, but there's this tension that underlies everything there. And so, it's been interesting, Preston. Like, I've gotten a ton of feedback from Liberty World. People, a lot of alums, a lot of current professors, current students. And what's really interesting to me is that despite having really scrutinized the place the way that I did, and having turned up some really ugly information and presented liberty in a not very flattering light, almost every single response I've gotten, email I've gotten from Liberty people has been very gracious and grateful, and basically just people saying, we knew some of this was going on. Thank you. I think you've done a service to us by writing about it. And that's encouraging to me.
Have you gotten some negative feedback? Or any like aggressive? Okay, you don't. I don't like to put you on.
No. I mean, look, this. Here's the thing. Like, I've covered Trump for years. I've gotten very used to the hate mail and the threats and that sort of stuff. It doesn't really bother me anymore. And I think, there are people who are. Let me say it this way. I'll be a little bit diplomatic with how I say this. I am not infallible. I know that I got things wrong in the book. I know that my personal beliefs, my personal exegesis, my journalistic analysis is not bulletproof, right? And I am welcoming of good faith criticisms. I asked my pastor to read the manuscript before it ever went to print, and we had some great back and forths where he was criticizing certain things, and I love that, and it made the book better, right? And I have friends who have read it who have their own. That's great. Like, I welcome that sort of thing. But then you also have sort of I think a cottage industry of people who have a vested interest in whitewashing tombs and who are going to respond in bad faith, trying to delegitimize me, trying to delegitimize my findings, trying to undermine some of the core arguments of the book. And they're doing so to try to protect a status quo in the evangelical movement that is badly broken.
Yeah. Isn't it ironic that if you critique, say, the evangelical use of worldly power, if you've poked that bear, they will react by using power to try to intimidate you. That's the very same kind of posture. You're kind of saying this isn't really Christian, they will turn around and write you that strong threatening email or threaten this, threaten that, or they'll try to use their money and power to shut you up. It is a little, I guess, ironic. So liberty is you look at for lack of better terms, the underbelly of a lot of. And I would almost frame it like that. Is that fair? That like the wedding, the kind of worldly use of power, money, influence, top down, like the church is kind of like entanglement with that, whether it's politics, whether it's money. You expose that on various levels. Do you see, if you go back, like the rise of the moral majority, when this was just such a popular thing, you had a lot of these really uber influential people. I mean, the whole Falwell, and I maybe could throw in maybe like a Dobson or whatever. I don't know much about that, but I've heard he was kind of part of that kind of, the rise of the moral majority. Have you seen things change? So let's just say 1980 to 2024. In my world, we just see so many problems with that. Like, I'm in a more moderate kind of brand of evangelicalism where it's just like there's just such a disgust with that kind of evangelicalism. is it getting better or is it getting worse? Because it depends on what social media kind of look at. It seems like it's even worse now. It's like all I see people is like if I, looked at my Twitter feed and said, I want to learn about Christian nationalism. 19 out of 20, people who mention it, it's profoundly critical. It's like, well, wait, if anybody's critiquing it, is this even a thing? But then people say, oh no, this is a very powerful thing and it's growing and it's threatening democracy and all these things. So in your sense, where are we at now in 2024 compared to 1980 in that kind of wedding of evangelicalism and the use of power and money and so on?
It's a really good question. And I think from where I'm sitting, it's getting worse, but it's got to get worse before it gets better. And what I mean by that is one of the sort of thematic undercurrents of the book is the generational component to this. I think for someone like my dad who is with the Lord now, and I miss him every day, and in a lot of ways he was my sort of my role model in the faith. And yet, he and I disagreed on some pretty important things, some pretty fundamental things, specifically when it comes to that marriage of sort of cultural, political, tribal identity and faith identity. And I think that for someone like my dad, who, if he were still alive, he'd be in his late 70s. He was really sort of born in that moment, spiritually. And born again, actually, in that moment in the 70s, where this feeling of we've got to do something came very naturally to a lot of people of his generation, and particularly if you were already of a really strongly held conservative political disposition, as my dad was before he even became a Christian. People like that. I think it was sort of a no-brainer. It was very effortless. It was almost subconscious to merge those identities together. And I think what we've seen, particularly in like the last, 10 years here, as I write about in the book, with the sort of radicalizing of the Republican Party, the emergence of Donald Trump, COVID-19, which I just can't begin to explain how significant that has been in the fracturing of the church, but also in the sort of revealing of these generational fault lines I'm describing. I think when you add all of that up, what we've seen is that those older generations who really bought into this thing are now sort of seeing the whirlwind being reaped, and that the younger generations are witnessing it and are saying, no, thank you. I don't want any part of this, right? You guys had this experiment and it failed. It failed spectacularly. Now, and I want to say that in a respectful, loving way, because I do think that a lot of those older folks, that they were just sort of working with what they knew. And in fairness, some of them stepped away a long time ago from this. Cal Thomas, who I write about in the book, Cal wrote this book much longer. He wrote it in the 90s. He wrote this book called Blinded by Might, where he had been Falwell Sr.'s deputy as a vice president of the moral majority. And he eventually stepped away and said, guys, like, not only are we losing a lot of these culture wars, these political battles that we're charging into, but in the process, we are just doing enormous damage to the gospel, and we are undermining the legitimacy and the credibility of our own witness here. So you've had sort of little breaks along the way, but by and large, what you see, the elements that I'm writing about in my book, these dynamics are driven overwhelmingly by Christians, evangelicals who are over 50, who have really sort of stuck to their guns with this old school moral majority approach. And I think that until there's sort of a changing of the guard, demographically speaking, you're not going to see this get any better. The interesting thing, Preston, we're talking about liberty. I've spent a lot of time with kids at Liberty, students there who are very conservative. They're conservative theologically, culturally, politically. On paper, they look a lot like their parents. But when it comes to questions of Trumpism, when it comes to questions of engaging with their neighbor in the culture, they're completely different. I mean, they have a very, very different outlook on these things. And so my hunch is that here in the immediate term, the next 5, 10, 15 years, it probably continues to get worse. But if we can survive this short term and buy ourselves some time for these younger generations to really get their footing and to take hold of these institutions in evangelical life, then I think it's going to get a lot better.
So I only promote products in the show that I either use myself or ones that I can, in good faith, recommend. And so this is why when AG1 wanted to sponsor Theology in the Raw, it was an easy yes, because I'd already been taking AG1 for over 6 months before we even agreed on sponsorship. So AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut health, stress management, and immune support. AG1 is packed with prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut support, magnesium and B vitamins for energy support, adaptogens to balance my body's stress levels, and vitamin C and zinc to help support my immune health. It's like a nutritional blast to the body, and when I take it every day, I experience a noticeable difference in both my sustained energy and my mental clarity and focus. And especially since I travel a lot, where you typically don't sleep well or eat very well, AG1 has just been a game changer. I now take it twice a day when I'm speaking and traveling. So if you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3, K2, and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. So just go to drinkag1.com/TITR. That's drinkag1.com/TITR. Check it out. I have a theory. This isn't my theory. People have talked about this, but when it comes to the generational difference, at least, well, I love your thoughts. It seems like part of it has to do with where people are getting their news from. Whereas like older people, they trust kind of these mainstream outlets, whether it's, on the left, more CNN or MSNBC or Fox News on the right or others, But then like younger people, typically they get their news from like, TikTok or social media and stuff. We have just a whole array of different stuff that oftentimes isn't revealed on the sometimes at the top. I mean, not to get into Israel-Palestine, but it is fascinating what view people have of what's going on is largely based on the outlets they are trusting and getting their information from, or any kind of conflict, or even right now you have campus protests and stuff, and it's kind of the same thing. I don't know. Do you think do you think the source of where people are getting their information from has something to do with kind of what narrative they typically will resonate with? Or?
Oh man, totally. And this is a generational thing. You're right. I agree. Without fail, when I have in these last bunch of years traveled around the country, spent time with some of these older folks in these evangelical settings, one of the questions I always will come back to is, okay, so where are you getting your news, your information from, right? And at the shallow end of the pool, a lot of these people have Fox News on every day, buzzing in the background of their living room for 3, 4, 5 hours. And in the deep end, where things get really sort of dark and dangerous, I think, is, these people are listening to podcasts that you've never even heard of. They are, they're imbibing these really conspiratorial, nutty social media pages. They are listening to really hardcore conservative talk radio that's like militant and sort of just reliably hostile and antagonistic in its approach. And that is a feature, not a bug. It is a feature of these older generations where, and again, I want to say this lovingly and graciously, because I know a lot of these people. I mean, my dad was one of these people. He had Fox News on every day of his life. The last 10 years he was alive, right? And I would sort of tease him about it and say, like, call me crazy, but like that doesn't sound like the Beatitudes to me. That doesn't sound like the Sermon on the Mount to me. Like now I'm not suggesting that we all need to be Puritans here, right? But there is something interesting about how when I was a kid, and I'm guessing a lot of evangelicals out there listening to this will be nodding their heads in agreement, in solidarity. My parents were so intense policing what my brothers and I were putting into our minds, right? If you had a Beastie Boys album that you snuck into your room, you were done, right? If they caught you watching an R-rated movie, if they even heard that you were watching an R-rated movie at a friend's sleepover, like you were grounded,
or The Simpsons. You know? The Simpsons are like off limits.
Totally. Simpsons. I mean, yeah. Don't get me started, right? So, and honestly, Preston, looking back on that, I'm really grateful because I think it was a good thing. I think my parents were really smart in making sure that that our impressionable young minds were to some degree guarded from a lot of garbage that's out there, right? I appreciate them and I respect them for that. And yet, what makes my head spin a little bit is how a lot of evangelical parents who were like that have themselves completely suspended any standard when it comes to their own sort of political and cultural intake, right?
Yeah.
That they can allow this steady stream of hate and vitriol and violence and racism to every day to be just invading, and they just don't think twice about it, right? And you know, that to me, Russell Moore shares this really funny anecdote, and I print it somewhere in the book, where he says that this very thing, where he says, at the beginning of my ministry years, Russell says, I used to always run into parents who would say, "You've got to help me with my kids. They're filling their minds with all this dangerous stuff, and it's taking them further away from Christ." And he says, now, and everywhere I go, I have young people grabbing me and saying, "Hey, you have to help me with my parents. They're filling their minds with all this dangerous stuff, and it's taking them further away from Christ." And that is, I mean, it's funny, but it's sad, right? Because that is, I think, a big part of this generational crisis we're dealing with.
I wonder if that, because it seemed like you and I can see it as a double standard because we get it, but I could see, you know, people might just take the news as, well, this is just passing on neutral information, but it's like, you know, that's just what's the who's that famous writer who wrote he talked about the medium is the message, oh gosh, back in the 80s, killing me. Anyway, that the means by which you are getting your information will shape your heart and mind. Don't think you're just getting just neutral facts. And I feel like from my vantage point, it's gotten in the last 10 years more and more and more polarized and tribalistic, largely because maybe the way the algorithms are, or even the economics of it, that now to keep people angry and fearful, they're going to keep clicking and clicking and clicking and go down that rabbit hole you said so many people go down. And so I think people, if you just view it as, oh, this isn't like something bad like The Simpsons, this is just neutral information I'm consuming. And it's like, no, it's actually not that at all. Like, it's shaping your mind and heart. Whenever I sample, I try to get my info. I try to, you know, get diverse sources, typically more independent, nonpartisan, you know, and then I cross-check that with others. But what I do dabble the stuff that does seem to be clearly more partisan. Like I know within 5 seconds who they voted for or will vote for. I find my own heart, even though I'm like aware of this, I feel like I've got a good immunity to it. Like I can, within minutes, I get sucked in. I start getting angry, like, oh yeah, you know, that side or this side. Like, well, if I'm aware of it and I still feel my heart start to pound, like I can imagine somebody who just has a steady drip all day long of this stuff. One thing I wonder if you've gotten this critique, and I had it in the back of my mind, but I feel like I kind of know. Well, not know, but I feel like I can almost answer my own question, knowing your heart. Like, could the critique be like, okay, you really picked on kind of the right wing marriage between right wing politics, Christianity? Isn't it just as bad? Maybe not numerically, but isn't the same problem with those who just swing it the other direction? And all of a sudden now, instead of being, you know, they're so anti-Trump that now they think the Messiah is not Jesus but Biden. Like that, so now everything is about anti-Republican Party, but it's almost like now they're just kind of doing the same thing on the other side. Do you see that as, well, I guess a problem? Would that be a fair critique? Have you gotten that critique, and what would be your response to that?
Yeah, look, so I have, and I've got no issue with the critique, sort of at kind of in an abstract way. But what I write in the opening pages of the book is meant to address that head on, which is to say, look, in any setting where for Christians something else has taken center stage and sort of pushed Jesus to the side, then and it has become an idol to you, then that is sinful and it is wrong and it has to be addressed. I cannot hope to address that in all of the various traditions and subcultures of American Christianity. What I can try to do is address it both in the place where it's most immediate for me and where I think it's been the most dangerous for the American experiment in pluralistic self-government, right? So those two things, I'll unpack them individually. So number one, right, I am a white evangelical. I grew up in a small, super white, super conservative, super Republican, super evangelical town, and in a church that reflected those dynamics. So that's the world that I was raised in, and it's the world that I know intimately from the inside out. Okay. And I think I think you always have to be careful whether you're, building a business or writing a book or whatever, or preaching a sermon. Like when the main thing stops becoming the main thing and you suddenly start trying to sort of, do everything at once, then you fail. And this book was not necessarily meant to address the entire sweep of problems across American Christianity, even though there are lots of them. And again, I say that early in the book to be clear. I think the second thing is, for all of the issues in the progressive church, and there are a lot of them, and I'm happy to even get into some of them with you if you'd like. I have not seen a marriage of political progressives and Christian progressives create the conditions for violence and mass civic unrest that we've seen from the other side, from the political right and from the religious right. So to me, that's a qualifiable and quantifiable difference, like a major one, where to say that on the one hand, is it completely cringeworthy and inappropriate, in my view, that when Joe Biden is in this black church in South Carolina several months ago and the congregants are chanting 4 more years inside the sanctuary? Yes. Do I place that in exactly the same category as I do the people who are in prayer circles outside the Capitol on January 6th and then carrying crosses into the Capitol as Capitol policemen are being beaten with American flagpoles? No, not exactly. I think those are slightly different things. And yet, I think they both stem from, I think maybe you would consider them both symptoms, different symptoms of the same basic illness, which is that in American life, we have been coddled, we have been spoiled, we have become so accustomed to the comforts and the security of empire that we have no idea what it's like to live in a truly marginalized countercultural state, the way that Christianity thrived, at least in the first 3.5 centuries after the death and resurrection of Christ. And when you spend time with people, Christians from around the world, or if you do missionary work, which I have, and you interface with these people, they just sort of cock their head to the side and look at you like you're a little bit crazy, right? Like it's very difficult for the American Christian to not make an idol out of politics, not make an idol out of the culture, out of your sort of social tribe, because you have come to view those things as being sort of very much all interconnected. And I think if the core message of what I'm writing in the book is that we are called to be disciples of Christ, and only by dying to those other identities can we truly discover our identity in Christ. That same message applies across the board. It just so happens that I'm addressing it very directly to my little corner of the kingdom.
I think that's completely fair. That's exactly what that's what I get accused of the same thing. I'll see people on social media saying, that I punch right and coddle left. Like, well, if you got me in a room and asked me, let's just talk more comprehensively political stuff, you're not going to hear any coddling to the left. In fact, you might, I might sound probably more conservative than you think I would be. But as you said, there's two things on the right that you don't have on the left. Number one, the numbers. I mean, if you ask, like, what's the percentage of evangelicals that might struggle with right-wing political idolatry versus left-wing? I don't know what the data is going to show. Is it, 90%, 95% more of a problem on the right wing? And secondly, you don't have as much of left-wing political leaders pandering to the evangelical church. They might, as you meant, they might do so with maybe the black church more, and see some of that come out. And if there's actually been an uptick of younger black voters, especially voting more Republican, which is interesting. But in general, you have this dominant machine, the white evangelical church that the right wing will pander to, that they will take the lead on using Christian rhetoric. You have, a lot more right wing kind of Christian people, or people who say they're Christians in office, that are saying the most un-Jesus like things about all kinds of stuff. So, so both the numbers and the clear attempt to enmesh the evangelical church with right wing political positions. Is that, that sounds like that's kind of what you were saying too. Like, and it's you and I both. I think it's easier, or it's probably better. It's more prophetic to critique your own tribe rather than constantly lobbing maybe, the bomb across the bow and try to hit another tribe that you weren't really raised in. So, are you hopeful? Like, where you said it needs to get worse before it gets better. Well, let me ask you a specific question within that. Christian nationalism, because this is kind of a theme you've addressed as well. I don't know what the thing is. This a loud, largely insignificant movement that seems bigger and more powerful than it is, or is it the greatest threat to the church and democracy as we know it, or is there something in between those two perspectives? And I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
I think it's somewhere in the middle, but here's the way I would categorize it is, when you look at the data, when you listen to the social scientists who have really studied this and can speak to it with a lot of a lot of authority, and authority that comes from the study, not the anecdotal, they will sort of emerge with the conclusion that basically this is a problem. It is not a problem at scale, but it is a problem. And when you sort of read between the lines and you study this, I think the great threat at scale isn't Christian nationalism as it exists in this moment. It is sort of the huge adjacent numbers of the Christian nationalist curious people who are sort of straddling the line between wanting to be a little bit more faithful and a little bit more rigid, trying to compartmentalize their politics away from their faith, and trying to, be discipled in the right way, and not sort of have this cultural formation dominate their lives. But they're freaked out by what they see around them. And especially in an election year, right? They maybe start to lose that discipline a little bit, right? They're kind of in that gray area. And, based on some of what we see happening in this country right now. I mean, you were alluding to some of it earlier, but like, let's face it. If you are on the fence, if you are sort of Christian nationalist curious, if you're even a little bit susceptible to this message that they are out to get us, that they're trying to, de-Christianize this country. They want to persecute us. They want to marginalize us. They want to eventually eradicate, faith from public life. If you're looking around in recent years, I can understand how you might just sign on and say, okay, I'm in, right? Because, there's no doubt that there are forces in the culture that are trying to, that are completely hostile towards Christianity and that would love to see the church destroyed. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a couple things we have to consider. And one of them is, okay, if there are people who want to see the church destroyed, are we, by responding in kind, only serving to advance their mission, right? Mm. By fighting fire with fire, are we actually helping to destroy the church because we are feeding this perception that all we care about are the culture wars, all we care about is political power, all we care about is vanquishing our opponents and subjugating our enemies and conquering the world around us, right? I quote near the end of the book this professor at Liberty who has sort of, he and his family have seen sort of the rise and fall of the school, and he's sort of heartbroken over it. And I talked to him about what it might look like to do things differently. And he's very emotionally talks about what if we were to lay down our defenses? What if we were to truly turn the other cheek and just love those who hate us? What would that look like, right? And I think it's a sign, it's a reflection of the state of American Christianity that when I say that, many of your listeners will sort of think that it's a rhetorical flourish rather than a genuine idea, right? What if we tried it?
What if we lived out this Sermon on the Mount? Like, I don't know what would.
Yeah, I mean, really. I mean, and again, by the way, let me be clear. Like, I struggle with this every day. I'm no better than anyone else here. Maybe I'm worse. I'm not holding myself out to be some exemplar, but I think it's really easy in this environment with the world looking the way that it does and with this country at loggerheads and hyper-polarized around everything. I think it's really easy to get sucked into this us versus them, good versus evil mentality. And when you do that, then you start to assign a, good versus evil. It becomes, politics become like the proxy war for it. And so you sign up with your side thinking you can't negotiate with evil. You have to destroy evil. And when you take that sort of approach to your neighbor and to your community and to the people who disagree with you on things, that is a recipe for disaster for the church. Yeah. And so while I understand it and I'm sympathetic to a certain degree to why people have become radicalized in these religious spaces, if we allow the what is at present this pretty small base of hardcore Christian nationalist ideologues, if we allow that group to sort of grow its ranks and to grab a hold of the levers of institutions and then try to sort of weaponize those institutions to dominate their enemies, real and perceived, it is going to do just incalculable damage to the reputation of the church. And I think that's what we should all be on guard against.
Amen. Oh man, it's so good, Tim. Love your perspective, man. I'm glad you're out there, and I'm so glad this book has gotten so much attention. Whenever I look at the Amazon rankings, I'm like, dude, you're crushing it with sales, man. And I'm so glad so many people are reading this. And your book has found its way into a lot of like more secular spaces. I think the first interview I heard you on was on Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar, which was, I was like shocked to hear like on this very secular outlet, and I think they do great journalism. But to hear you talk really explicitly about your evangelical faith, like I've never heard anything like that on Breaking Points before. So,
well, it's funny because that's another criticism I've gotten is like,
really?
here's this guy lecturing about what's wrong in the church while he's on the MSNBC set. And it's like, well, hold on a second. I mean, ultimately, what does it mean to evangelize, right? Like, are we not supposed to be prioritizing these secular spaces? Are these not?
Yeah.
Are they, this is, I view it as a mission field, man. So like, that's it. I'd be remiss if I didn't address that, because that, for whatever reason, that's been a real touchy subject for a lot of people, believing that like, well, some good Christian you are hanging around CNN primetime. And I'm just thinking, well, like, okay, but what if there's even a single person watching who might be out there searching for something? And the amazing thing, I will just say this in closing, because it's been totally unexpected, but totally life-giving to me in this process. Some of the deepest, most respectful and curious conversations I have had in the last 6 months have been in the green rooms at MSNBC, have been at these very secular, like New York society events that I've gone to, where people, they might be hostile reflexively towards, evangelicalism or hostile towards the church, but they're not hostile towards Jesus. In fact, when you start talking to them about Jesus, they lean in and they want to know more. And so maybe that's a sign that we've been thinking about this in the wrong way, right? Maybe these secular spaces, which seem so scary to us, maybe if we approached them with something more loving and something more Christ-centered as opposed to something more sort of belligerent and culture war-centered, maybe, just maybe, we would find ourselves in a very different situation.
Man, that's so good. That's a great way to end our car. Keep going, but we both have stuff to do. Tim, it's an honor to talk to you on Theology in the Raw. Thanks so much for your work, and thanks so much for your book. I'll hold it up here one more time: The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory: American Evangelicals in the Age of Extremism. And I highly encourage my audience to pick it up. It's one of those books that's really hard to put down. Thanks so much for being on Theology in the Raw, Tim.
Hey, my pleasure, Preston. Thanks for having me.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.